Hey everyone, welcome back to our weekly live show. My name is Jackie and I'm from the American Society for the Positive Care of Children, or ASPCC. And today I'm so excited to welcome Matt Larson on the show. Matt is a parenting relationships researcher, tech entrepreneur, investor, and philanthropist. He spends most of his time on a nonprofit initiative called the Human Improvement Project, which distributes completely free, ad-free parenting and relationship apps. The two that are the biggest, they're called In Love While Parenting and the Happy Child app. These apps are installed over 100,000 parents each month in over 165 countries and 15 languages. On top of his impressive accolades as an entrepreneur, Matt and his wife also operate a family foundation dedicated to reducing child exploitation. They've lobbied successfully for hundreds of millions in additional federal spending dedicated to this cause. So today we've invited Matt to our show to talk about how we can best support our kids and families at home right now. So Matt, thank you so much again for coming on the show. We're really, really excited to have you today.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So to kick things off, the Human Improvement Project, it's a research-based nonprofit foundation that you guys have developed, the Happy Child app, which teaches parents the reasons why some children form good behaviors, right? It teaches parents the reasons why some children form good homes will grow up to make poor decisions.
That's right.
So I figure we could start there.
Sure. Yeah. So basically what we have found out in our research is that we have a lot of very well-meaning parents who work really hard, and the children inside their family end up having very different life outcomes. So some of their kids will go on to have high levels of well-being, and other kids in that same family will go on to have low levels of long-term well-being. And it turns out that there's these different things that parents do accidentally that they don't know that they should be doing or shouldn't be doing, that until recent technology in the research area allowed us to discover these things, we just had no way of knowing, what impact they were having on our kids. So our organization really has two parts. One, we're a research organization, so we fund research inside of universities. We do our own research. And our main question is, what are the things that make the biggest difference to long-term well-being? And because as parents, every week some new study comes out. So this week it's blueberries, and blueberries are good for us. So we parents rush out and we buy blueberries. And then the next week it's, push-ups are better than sit-ups. And so we tell our kids to, do a certain type of exercise. But the reality is, when we've measured those types of things, and we've measured everything you can imagine, we've measured things like, getting your kids to eat their vegetables, getting your kids to, clean their rooms, giving kids chores versus not giving them chores. And the list goes on and on. Almost none of them make any noticeable difference to long-term well-being. And it turns out that there's really only two things that seem to make up the bulk of it, along with some genetic factors. And so that's really what we focus on from a research perspective. And then we have an education side, which are the apps that allow us to get that out to the public. And so that's basically what we do.
Yeah. And from your videos, I was seeing that you guys used research from FMRIs to watch the brain activity and like how it responds to different things. And that's kind of how you've developed these exercises in your app, right?
That's right. So in the past, we would have certain things inside of certain parental behavior that seem like a good idea. So let's say a child is upset, and we then do what we call problem solving. We try to help the child solve whatever problem it was that they got upset. And as parents, we're trying to help. It wasn't until these FMRI studies started come out, and there's been tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of these, where we started watching what was happening during the brain during those situations. So we might see in this child, for example, that when the parent problem solves, the threatened parts of that child brain light up. And that was sort of puzzling. Like, why is that? I mean, the parent's trying to do the right thing. And then they could test other things. So they could say, okay, now the child's talking about an upsetting situation. How about if we try validating their emotions, which is a really good skill, one of the skills that we teach. And then we would see that the parts of their brain that feel, where they feel loved or where they feel comforted or where they're building a bond, those parts seem to light up. So that technology really allowed us to debunk a lot of parenting myths and strategies that in the past it was really just idea based. So if I was a parenting expert, I would say, I think when I do this with my child, it seems like I get a good response from them. And so that's going to be my parenting philosophy. But it really wasn't based in hard science. It was just my own experience and how good I was at talking you into assigning on to my parental approach. But really, we've now thankfully gotten to this phase where a lot of that has sort of been, swept aside as that isn't really what's going on here. It really are these other two main issues that are making the biggest difference.
Yeah. And I guess it's for parents, it's different too, because they have the intention of this is what I'm going to tell my child to do. And I expect them to behave this way, but they also do these behaviors that they don't realize that their child is watching. Right. And that's what kids are picking up on. So I was curious, this year, it's obviously different, and families are dealing with different kinds of stresses. Are there ways that parents can better cope with their own stresses or check themselves so they don't put that on their kid?
Yeah. So the way I describe it is that imagine if your child just broke a leg. Mm-hmm. We said, okay, they just broke their leg. What's my top priority now? Well, obviously it's to get their leg fixed, right? To do whatever you need to do to get their leg fixed. But if you ask the same question and you said, well, but now it's COVID. Now what's my top priority? It's like your top priority is the same. It's still to get the broken leg fixed. And that's basically what we found out, is that these core fundamental skills are the most important inside of COVID or outside, but they're even more important inside of COVID, because the two things that most make a difference in terms of long-term well-being are both being negatively affected by COVID. So the first thing that we look at in kids that is the biggest predictor of long-term well-being is their cortisol levels. So, but only in a certain area. So there's cortisol levels for lots of things that are really important in our body and that are not what we're talking about. But we're talking about in just a very certain situation where their cortisol levels are elevated because they're nervous that something's about to happen that could cause their emotions to suddenly plummet. So an example of this that happened in my own family with me was that I had a child who I would make a sarcastic, what I thought was a funny comment once a month. Well, he was nervous the entire month whenever he was around me that I might make one of those jokes. And so his cortisol was elevated constantly around me because of that. And I had no idea. I felt horrible once I found out about it and knew how important this was. But there turns out to be a lot, turns out to be a lot of things that we don't have time to get into right now that basically keep those cortisol levels elevated. That's the number one thing that's higher in COVID because we're now nervous because we're all cooped up more. We're nervous that, our family members are going to fight with each other, that we're going to get aggravated with each other. So that is even worse in COVID, but the solution is the same and is even more important. The second element is oxytocin. But again, oxytocin is used for lots of different things. We're only talking about oxytocin that is released inside of safe relationships where you don't get betrayed. And in those situations, so that's like getting a hug from mom, for example, releases oxytocin and turns out is really important. And so with COVID, we're also getting less interaction. So you get more oxytocin you could think of it as almost the more personal the interaction is. So if I send a text to somebody, neither one of us get any oxytocin. If I have a phone call with them, we can hear each other's voice, we get a little bit more. If we have a video chat, we get more. If we are able to chat face to face, we get even more. If I give them a hug, we get even more. So sort of the more interaction we have, the more we have of this chemical that we call the long-term happiness chemical. And that is also being impacted by COVID. We are not able, the kids aren't able to have as much time with their friends. So they're getting hit on both sides. Their oxytocin levels are even higher than, their cortisol levels are even higher than normal, which is not good. Their oxytocin levels are even lower than normal, which isn't good. So it's being exacerbated by COVID. The good news is that a lot of parents, probably like the ones that are watching this, are actually now paying more attention to their child's mental health. They're watching things like this, and they're learning these solutions that, again, won't just help in the short term during COVID. They will help that child for the rest of their lives. And so in that sense, I'm really optimistic for at least that set of parents that their kids, the fact that things got worse during COVID and it caused their parents to really pay attention to this will actually turn out to be a huge positive in those child's lives.
Yeah, those are really good points. I'm just even thinking over the summer, watching my son, who's 6 now, and there's one day he really wanted to ride his bike with friends, and I told him no. And instead of just being like, okay, I'll go do something else, he had a complete breakdown. And it was just so strange to see of him, because he's just like, it was like he had all of this really big emotion inside of his tiny body, and he just couldn't handle it. Mm-hmm. And it's gotten better now, but like he also does this thing where he'll grind his teeth really hard at night. And I know if I'm experiencing this in my home, other parents are experiencing this too, and like are seeing these changes in their kids. So it's really important to just notice their cues, but then also be that, I loved how you phrased this, like this emotional safe haven, like create that for your kids. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how like our home base and the deep connections that you build with your family, that can be your emotional safe haven. Like how do we form that?
Sure. So the concept of emotional safe haven is essentially that your home should be this place that they can recover from the tough storms of life. So when your child goes out into the world, you don't need to go out and make sure nobody ever hurts their feelings, fight all of their battles for them. They need to learn to go out and survive in the tough world. But what does seem to make a big impact is that they can come home and have an emotional safe haven. Now, what does that mean? Well, ideally, that means that they have family members who are skilled at helping them process their emotions. So when they come home from a hard day, ideally they have somebody like a parent who knows the right steps to help them process those emotions, because that not only builds a deep bond with the parent, which is really important. That's one of the main things that we look at is how, did the child have a bond with one or more parents? If they didn't, that's not a good indicator of long-term well-being. If they had one with one parent or parent figure, that's a huge improvement. And if they had it with two, that's really optimal. So you want a situation where the whole family realizes that each relationship with the other members of the family, if I have a deep bond with them, like let's say if you tell one sibling, if you have a deep bond with your other sibling, it will give both of you higher long-term well-being. If you don't have a deep bond with your sibling, you will both lose. You will both have a lower long-term well-being. And that goes the same thing with your mom or your dad or whoever else is in that situation. So if you can get everybody in the family realizing that I need to actively work to have a deep bond with every other family member for both of our sakes, you kind of get into this spiral where you get a lot of really good behavior, because frankly, we're selfish human beings. I mean, that's just the way we are. And so if you realize I need to have these deep bonds for me, you really get incented to have all sorts of good behavior. So that is part of what creates this emotional safe haven. Now, one of the things that we find is that there's a spectrum. So kind of imagine a spectrum on one side where the person is an emotional threat, and another side, and that means you're nervous they're going to say something negative about you or somehow cause your emotions to plummet. And on the other side of that spectrum is somebody who is an emotional comfort to you. There's somebody who validates your feelings and has a deep bond with you and so on. Well, if we look at a child and we say, okay, where is each family member on that spectrum? And we find that they have a lot of family members on the emotional threat side, that child is going to grow up, have a low level of well-being, and they're going to likely reject the morals and beliefs of that family. If we talk to a child and they have people on the emotional safety side, they'll mostly identify other family members as being emotionally safe. Then that child will have close relationships with those family members. They will likely have similar beliefs and views and political views and everything, you name it, to that. So it turns out it's really important to think about the people who are in our kids' lives. Where would that other person be on this spectrum? Would this person be an emotional comfort to our child or an emotional threat? Because if we have a lot of emotional threats, that's going to have a big impact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I guess those exercises are in your app where we can practice like building those deep bonds. And I don't think that's something that parents think about anymore, or I'm sure they do, but it's not conscious. It's like you have your child and you feel like the deep bond is just already there and you don't have to do any work, but it's something that we always have to continuously do. Especially as the child grows and we go through this year and we go through this school year, it's going to be different. So I really appreciate that insight. And there was one other question I wanted to ask you before you go. I've heard you talk in your videos about emotional safety spectrum, and we kind of touched on that just now, but I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about that. Like, how do you, I don't know, where do parents land and how do children affect like the parents' emotional spectrum? And like, because it goes both ways, right?
It does go both ways. I mean, obviously the parents have a lot more impact. If they learn these skills, the parents have can obviously change the home dramatically, and have a lot more impact. But so I think a common one of a parent who thinks they're probably on the right side of this, on the correct side of the scale, but really isn't, is somebody who says "I love you" to their kids, gives them hugs sometimes, but then emotionally ambushes them once a month. They say something critical. They say something sarcastic. And so they think, oh no, I'm on the good side. I'm on the emotional comfort side. But then when they actually ask their child about it and ask them, are you nervous? That I'll say or do something that's going to hurt your feelings. The child says yes. And they realize they're not on the right, that side of the spectrum. And I think, with the bonds, you brought up a really good point of saying, hey, I have a great bond with my 2-year-old, for example, right? We all kind of feel like we do. But the unfortunate thing is that if you don't learn the steps to build a deep bond, you are unlikely to have a deep bond with your adult child. And, we don't want to hear that as parents, but it's important to know that, because you don't want to get into that place where you just don't. And you won't quite know why. I don't, other than you'll think, well, I pointed out that they were lazy and, or they had these negative character traits, and that's why we're not close now. But all of that is really just happens because we don't understand the science of how to build a deep bond. And so I'd really encourage parents to do that, to take the time to really learn how to do that, because even though you've got a great relationship with the 2-year-old right now, they go through a lot of life changes. And again, unfortunately, the odds are not good. They're less than 50-50 that you'll end up having that deep bond if you don't learn these skills.
Wow. Thank you for saying that. I lost my train of words, so I'm just going to go to my outro.
Okay.
Thanks so much for joining us today. For everybody who is watching, if you'd like to connect with Matt or the Human Improvement Project, you can visit their site at humanimprovement.org. You can also get the Happy Child app there. And to you, our listeners who feel called to make a difference in the world or right in your own home, we thank you for participating in this conversation. And we'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye.